Hey everybody, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Candice and David and Zishan for organizing this, for getting me here, and for making sure I didn't spill pizza all over myself right before giving a talk with a light-colored shirt, which is something I would normally be prone to do. So today we're going to talk about Satoshi Nakamoto's famous paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, which incidentally has its 10-year anniversary on Halloween night of 2018. So 10 years ago on Halloween, so about 3 months from now, was when Satoshi first published this paper. A couple of logistical items. First, if you've got questions during the talk, I would super appreciate it if you could reply to this tweet that's on my timeline. So I'm JXXF on Twitter. And if you have questions and I don't get to them during the talk, that way I'll remember what they were, because I'm not going to remember if you said something or if you didn't get to it. This will also weed out the people who have more of a comment than a question, or who will talk for 5 minutes. And that way everybody will be happy and we'll get to the questions that we all really want to hear about. All right, cool. So with that much said, let me go back to my slides. All right, so yeah, so questions, you can email me if you don't want to put them on Twitter. If you have a super sensitive question, feel free to do that too. I'm John Feminella. I work for a company called Pivotal. It's actually right up the street on 6th Avenue, about 11 blocks away. We're always happy to have visitors, so if you ever are near 636 6th Avenue, feel free to stop by the 2nd, 5th, or 6th floors for a tour at Pivotal. All right, on to Bitcoin, or I should say the paper that introduced Bitcoin. So like I said, 10 years ago on Halloween night, someone using the name Satoshi Nakamoto sent an email to a very poorly trafficked, cryptography-focused email list. And this was more or less widely ignored at the time. The paper was published, it was there, it was distributed, but that's kind of all that happened. 2 or 3 months later, the same person, also identified as Satoshi Nakamoto, published this time a software client that implemented the ideas in the paper. And that was a little bit more interesting, because it's one thing to write an academic paper, and it's another thing to provide a proof of concept in the form of working software if it says that your paper actually does what it says on the tin. And that started to get some folks' attention, and people started using Bitcoin as represented by the software client that was propagated throughout the cryptography mailing list. And from there, the story kind of unfolded in a few more interesting directions. If you read throughout the paper, Satoshi introduces a few very novel concepts, some of which had been built on earlier ideas some were built on earlier ideas, some are completely novel. And I want to highlight a few of them for you. So the first is that he claims to, he or she or they, claim to have a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash. We'll come back to what that means later, but basically this seems to imply that there's some kind of digital equivalent to paper currency or coin, some kind of analog that's going on here. And this analog doesn't require an intermediary like, say, the Federal Reserve or a state or a government of some kind. And instead, it's completely electronic. There's no physical manifestation of this currency. Second, he says that they say that there's some problem that needs to be solved with digital signatures. And this problem is, in part, one of the problems they are trying to solve is something called double spending that hadn't really been solved in any reasonable way before this. There have been sort of attempts to do it, but it was this double spending problem that's really at the heart of what makes Bitcoin different from other attempts. And specifically, another thing that makes it different is this idea called proof of work. So a sort of investment in the currency itself in the form of sunk cost of computational effort and time is what's going to drive the value of this currency. And in particular, the currency defends itself against attack by having a lot of work sunk into it. So all of these ideas, not completely unique, not completely novel independently, but together, certainly they were novel. And to understand Bitcoin and what Satoshi was trying to do with the paper, what we think they were trying to do with the paper, it would help to think a little bit about what would a world without money look like? So no money at all. How would you conduct business? Well, a world without money, a world that has money, or at least doesn't have money in the form that we know it, let's say, what would a transaction in that world look like? What would take place? What would the properties of that interaction be? Let's imagine we have two people, one whom we'll call Alice, and Alice would like a piece of cake. Alice is a big fan of dessert, as am I, coincidentally. Then we have a second person, Bob, and Bob would like a watch. Bob, it turns out, is a baker, but he's also really late to things, doesn't open his shop on time, that sort of thing. So it would help him out if he could have a watch. Well, coincidentally, Bob, being a baker, is really good at making cake, and Alice, being a very professional businesswoman, does have a watch to keep herself on track and on time, and is willing to part with it in exchange for this slice of cake because she really loves dessert. So can we have a transaction here? Yes, because both parties want something that the other person has and have something that the other person wants. That's important. And because that's true here, we'll be able to swap the items and we'll conduct a transaction. What would a failed transaction look like? Well, that would be something like this. Alice and Bob both still want the same things. Alice wants a piece of cake and Bob wants a watch, but now Alice doesn't have a watch to give Bob. She only has her pet snail, Petunia. So Alice can give Bob the snail, but that's not something that he wants, so he doesn't want to make this transaction. So no transaction will occur. They won't be able to swap the items. Importantly, a transaction's only going to occur if both parties would be better off than they were before, or at least this is what economics tells us. So if people would only be willing to trade those two items if they want the other thing more than the thing that they have. How would we fix a failed transaction? Well, one way to fix a failed transaction would be to introduce this third party, Carol, who has something that Bob wants and who wants something that Alice has. She sort of sits as an intermediary here between the transactions. Now we can use the third party, Carol, to conduct a swap so that everybody winds up with something that they want and everybody's happier than they were before. But notice that we could only do that because we found someone like Carol. In other words, it's a coincidence that Carol existed. In fact, it's a coincidence that Alice and Bob even exist and have the things that the other person wants. And economists call the situation a double coincidence of wants. You both have to want something that the other person has, and you coincidentally have to find something, another person that also has what you want. So for example, if Alice has a watch and wants a piece of cake, there might be thousands of bakers, but do any of them want a watch? She'll coincidentally have to find one that does want a watch. So she might have to spend a lot of effort searching and trying to find someone who coincidentally wants that watch. Now in a world with money, things work a little differently. And to think about what money is, it might help to use a counterexample of something that we probably wouldn't think of as money, or at least today we wouldn't think of it as money. And that example is going to be a steak dinner. So what makes a steak dinner not money, or not good money at least? What kinds of properties would you expect your good money or bad money to have? Well, economists say that there are basically 5 properties that you want money to have. First, disintermediation. Does a steak dinner, as a form of currency, does it avoid the double coincidence of wants? Not really, because someone still has to want a steak dinner. So if you have a steak dinner, there's no guarantee you're going to find someone else who also wants a steak dinner. So from a disintermediation perspective, steak dinners don't really do a good job of money. Next, are steak dinners fungible? Can they be substituted easily for one another? Probably not. The steak dinner that I would cook is probably not as good as the steak dinner that, say, Gordon Ramsay would cook, right? So those are 2 steak dinners, but they're 2 very different steak dinners. So one steak dinner is not really the same as another. Here's a question for you. Are dollars fungible? Raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Raise your hand if you think the answer is no. Raise your hand if you're not sure or you want to say sometimes or something like that. Okay, cool. So I would say that for the most part, dollars are fungible. But think about this. What about a dollar that you have in your hand, a physical piece of paper, versus a dollar that's frozen in a bank account because you're an arms dealer and the government seized your funds? Well, those are $2, but the one that you have in your hand is worth a lot more than the one that's locked up in the frozen bank account. So in some sense, fungibility is a spectrum. It's not a binary property, right? The degree to which something is fungible depends in large part on what we're talking about, the situation and the context. Are steak dinners resilient? Do they hold their value over time? Probably not. The steak dinner that's been sitting out on the counter for 5 days is probably not worth as much as the one that's 5 seconds off the grill. Is the value of a steak dinner measurable? Will we both agree on what a steak dinner could buy? Probably not. What if you're a vegan? You don't want steak dinners as much as somebody who's been in the desert and is starving and hasn't eaten for 72 hours, right? So we won't agree necessarily about the value of the steak dinner. And then finally, is the steak dinner a debt instrument? Can it be used to repay debts that you owe someone? So if I do you a favor, like I paint your house, would I want to be repaid in steak dinners? Or if I take out a mortgage, will the bank accept 400,000 steak dinners in exchange for closing out my debt? Probably not. So for that reason, steak dinners are not really good at any of these properties. Can we do better than steak dinners as a currency? People who are advocates of something called fiat currency think so. Fiat is a Latin word that means it shall be. And this is basically the state or an institution or a government telling you that you should trust the money that it produces because it's backed by the power of the state. If you look at any physical dollar bill, or at least in the US, any physical piece of paper will say, among other things, it will say legal tender for all debts, public and private. That means that if someone owes you, if you owe someone a debt, they must accept dollars as repayment for that debt. Now, you hear these tales about people, going into a store and paying something that they owe with like pennies because they hate the, they hate the person that they're paying the money back to. Like that's sort of where this idea takes the extreme form. But if you go into like a restaurant where you haven't accrued any debt and you say, I'd like to pay with pennies, they can refuse. Just like if you go into a convenience store and they have a sign on the register that says, we don't accept any bills larger than $20. Well, that's legal to do because there's no debt being incurred. You don't have a debt with the convenience store until you bought something. We're not going to let you buy the thing unless you pay with bills and denominations of 20 or less. So the state here is producing a kind of currency that does have these properties, or at least it has them in a stronger sense than steak dinners do. So it disintermediates because we're willing to accept dollars in exchange for whatever we might want. You can't eat a dollar, you can't drink a dollar, but it's nevertheless useful because you are gambling that in the future you'll be able to take, if someone gives you a dollar in exchange for a good or a service or your labor for working 9 hours a day or whatever, you're getting that dollar and you're willing to take it because you're gambling that in the future you'll be able to exchange that dollar or dollars for goods and services. Somebody else will be willing to take the dollar for you. So it does disintermediate. Nobody wants the dollar intrinsically, they want what the dollar can buy. It's fungible for the most part. The counterexample is something like the arms dealer stuff, but for the most part, $1 bill is the same as another dollar bill. It's resilient because paper lasts a pretty long time. The Federal Reserve has billions, trillions of dollars in circulation in terms of physical pieces of paper, and they replace them very frequently, and you can get a new copy of a dollar bill at any time. So if you have a worn out dollar bill, you can go to your bank and get a new one, no problem. It's measurable because we all agree that $1 is 100 cents. If you don't agree with that, then you will find a lot of people who don't agree with you. It's a debt instrument because people are required to legally accept it. So in a world where money exists, this situation looks a lot different. Alice doesn't need to have anything that Bob wants because Bob will be willing to accept dollars in lieu of the thing that he actually wants to buy. So here, Alice and Bob can conduct their transaction and everybody's happier than they were before. But crucially, the difference between this and steak dinners is that we required the presence of a third party who looked an awful lot like Carol. This time, the third party is the government or the state that introduced the trust that allows us to use this currency to begin with. If we don't trust the state, if there isn't that relationship between the issuing entity and the money, then we may not want to use that money if we don't believe that we can use the money in the future for goods and services. So governments all the time have capital controls. They pass laws about what you can or can't do with the money. So for example, you can't, at least in the United States, you can't be an arms dealer and have a checking account at Wells Fargo. That's not okay. There are other things you can't do. For example, in 2017, President Trump passed a law that said that if you were perceived to be endangering American jobs, if your company was perceived to be endangering American jobs, it would be legal for the government to seize the assets of your company to preclude you from doing that any further. So that's a restriction on what you could do with dollars, effectively. So we have some questions about whether or not this money could be improved. But first, let's think about what the recipe for money looks like in terms of what the Bitcoin paper describes. And we're going to have to zoom out a little bit to think about this. But we can think about money, at least the fiat currency form of money, as having, or really all forms of money, as having three crucial ingredients that we're going to use to bake this cake. So the first crucial ingredient is trust. How do we know that the currency is genuine, that it hasn't been forged, and that it represents what it says it does on the tin? Second, rules. What are the rules about how we can exchange the money with each other? Who gets money? How is it produced? How is it destroyed? How is it recycled or regenerated in some way? And finally, the history. Where will we record which transactions have already happened? If we don't agree about whether a transaction has happened, that's really bad for our monetary system, because it means that I could go into, say, Five Guys and be like, I'd like a cheeseburger, please, and they take my money, and they don't give me a cheeseburger, and they say, that will be $5, please. I've already paid you. No, you didn't. Because there was no record of that transaction, it's possible that someone could claim that. So we need a reckoning, some kind of recording of where the transactions will live, in case there's any dispute about what happened, or just for the sake of posterity for accounting reasons. All right, so with fiat currency, the way we're going to fill out this recipe is that the trust is going to come from the state, from a government, from a federal bank, a central bank of some kind, something like that. The rules will come from laws, from the government passing legislation about what you can and can't do with the money. And the history comes from, at least in our central banking system, it comes from banks. Banks control what transactions did or didn't happen and the record of that. So the combination of those three things is what makes money. Now, or fiat currency, I should say. Crucially, fiat currency abstracts the details of what you need to understand about how that cake was baked from the people who are using the money. If I want to go to McDonald's or whatever and buy a cheeseburger, do I need to know anything about the Federal Reserve to spend the money? No, probably not. In fact, it would probably be really complicated if every time you went into McDonald's and wanted to buy something, you had to pass a test explaining who the 12 governors of the Federal Reserve were at that point in time. But you'd probably never be able to buy anything at that point, or I wouldn't. Can we do better in this? Well, Satoshi said one way to do better, or one way that seems like it's better at least, is what if we had a purely peer-to-peer version, no state, no intermediary, direct transactions between individuals? And what if that cash was electronic rather than physical? And what if that transaction took place without going through an institution? So people who are cryptocurrency advocates think that it is possible to do better, and they see that situation as being superior to the fiat currency world, or at least complementary to it in some way. And with cryptocurrency, at least with the Bitcoin paper, the way that we're going to fill out this cake is a little bit different. Our recipe looks slightly different. Actually, it looks really different, but the slots that we're going to fill in are the same. So the trust, instead of coming from the state, comes from math, comes from some formulas that describe, that can be proven to be true, that describe how the system will operate and what properties must hold across the lifetime of the system. So the trust is based on math, essentially. The rules are encoded into a protocol that defines how and when and where people can exchange money with each other through the Bitcoin network. And then finally, the history comes from a special data structure called the blockchain. That's where the history gets recorded. So all three of these things combined are what make a cryptocurrency, in this case, Bitcoin. Now, super duper important When people get like hyped about the blockchain, to me, that's like getting hyped about linked lists or arrays or hash tables. Like, it's just a data structure with some interesting properties. What actually makes, that's certainly an element of what distinguishes one cryptocurrency from another, but what actually makes a cryptocurrency distinct from each other is, I think, more about the rules than it is about anything else. What kinds of data will go onto the blockchain? Who is allowed to transact on this blockchain? Will the identities of the people who consume it be public? How, if not, how will they be anonymized? How will you guarantee that anonymity, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the rules are actually the more interesting part of this cake than the blockchain, which is more like the, like gross outside filling on the cylinder side of the cake instead of the cool filling on the inside of the cake. So the rules are really what describe what you can and can't do with the cryptocurrency and what kinds of data show up on the blockchain. But the blockchain that's associated with the particular cryptocurrency is just a history of what happened. Now, that's important because without the history, you can't agree on what did or didn't happen. But it's not the most interesting thing, I think. I think the most interesting thing is really what rules you're going to decide are true or not about your particular cryptocurrency. Now, importantly, are those details abstracted from users? Can you, if you want to buy Bitcoin, can you have an experience that's identical to paying with cash? Not really, not most of the time, not in most situations where that's where you could pay that way to begin with. So first of all, the set of businesses that would take that currency is extremely small, and then within that experience, the way that you can transact is also probably not as good as just paying with cash or paying with a credit card or whatever. So there's a little ways to go there, and maybe even more and a more concerning note, if you are a regular Joe who doesn't understand anything about the blockchain or cryptocurrency, it's almost trivially easy to lose everything you own. So imagine like you went to a cashier, you pulled out the credit card that you thought was the one you were going to pay with, you swipe it, oops, it's the wrong card, it's your business card. Now you're bankrupt. Like, that would not be an experience that most people would agree is acceptable, yet that's the sort of thing, it's a rough analogy, but that's the sort of thing where the one misapprehension about the correct field to fill in on your local wallet or whatever can result in disaster. And that's not an experience we generally have with transactions of an everyday nature. And even when we do have those sorts of experiences, they're typically able to be reversed. But that's one of the benefits of having that third-party intermediary. They can intervene when a transaction should not have happened. Is that worth it? Maybe not. Maybe it is, depending on your point of view. So again, each cryptocurrency's rules and history are what make it unique. Not so much the blockchain all by itself, but rather the collection of those two things. The math is more or less the same across different kinds of cryptocurrencies. There's some variation about how you prove that the cryptocurrency is trustworthy, but there's always that element of, yes, it is trustworthy because of the following reason. All right, I'm going to take a quick break here to see if anybody has asked me questions. Nope, not yet. Cool, so we'll keep going. All right, so this looks like a very different kind of money than the fiat currency, right? Before, we saw that the fiat currency is created through an institution, laws, and banks. With the cryptocurrency we're looking at, it's created through math and rules and a blockchain. So that looks so different that you might wonder, is it really money at all? Or is it a completely new kind of thing that just we're using the word money for, but isn't exactly the same thing? We'll come back to this idea. But in the meantime, let's build a cryptocurrency. Let's build the one that Satoshi built, or at least an approximation of it that will help us understand the ideas laid out in the paper. And the first idea I want to introduce is something called a ledger. And if you're not familiar with this idea, let's think of three roommates, Alice, Bob, and Carol, who live in the same apartment. And they're best buds. They go out to drinks every Friday. They're picking up the utilities one week after another. And they're kind of constantly swapping cash around to pay for each other's activities. So one week, Alice might pay Carol 15 bucks for a couple of drinks, or Bob might pay Alice 20 bucks for getting some delivery, and pay Carol 30 bucks for his share of the whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So we're shuffling a lot of cash around, and that might be a little cumbersome. Can we have a better experience for Alice, Bob, and Carol than having to constantly shuffle this cash around? Well, one alternative to shuffling the cash around on every transaction might be if we ask Alice, Bob, and Carol, they all collectively agree to front some money into a shared pot. And then they're going to record how much they each put in onto the shared ledger, a piece of paper that's going to sit on our refrigerator and just lets people write lines onto the piece of paper one at a time. So this ledger is going to record all the transactions that Alice, Bob, and Carol perform. And this ledger is a magical ledger. It's a piece of paper that never runs out of room. So they'll just keep stapling pieces of paper to the bottom of the first piece of paper if they ever run out of lines to record stuff on. Now, the first 3 lines on this ledger will record how much they each contributed to the shared pot, right? So we'll have a denotion like Alice put $100 into the shared pot, so did Bob, so did Carol. Now, when Alice wants to pay Carol $15, instead of paying her with cash, she's just going to update the ledger. So we'll need a set of rules that describes how and when people get to update the ledger and what they have to write on it to verify that that transaction was correct. So the first rule in our protocol is going to be, you know what? Anybody who's participating in this network, who's one of Alice, Bob, and Carol in this case, they can go ahead and add lines to that ledger. So now, instead of Alice paying Carol $15 in cash, Alice is just going to write a line onto this ledger that says, hey, I paid you $15. And that's going to update the ledger so that everybody can see it. It's on the refrigerator, right? Now, if the same is true for Bob or Carol, it's not specific to Alice. If he wants to record his transactions, he can certainly do that too. So this ledger is now substituting for the cash that they were shuffling around. What about if they have a really big transaction? So what if Alice needs to pay Carol her share of the rent, $1,500? Okay, well, that would be a pretty expensive rent. But Alice is paying Carol $1,500 for her share. But there isn't $1,500 in the shared pot. Alice only contributed $100, not $1,500. So she's effectively spending money on this ledger that she doesn't have. So we might say, okay, if you want to spend money you don't have, that's fine, but just make sure you settle up at the end of every week. So every Sunday night, please make sure that you've corrected any deficiency you have in this ledger. So you can see where the first problem might occur is that you can simply overspend money that you don't have on the ledger, and then when it comes time to collect, somebody can just say, sorry, I don't have that money, tough cookies. So we're going to change the rules. Instead of letting you overspend, we're going to say you can't overspend. No overspending is permitted. You can only spend money on a ledger that you've already contributed. At the moment that we make this rule, the second that there are those 2 rules, one rule about anybody can add lines to the ledger, and the second rule about you can't overspend, that means that we have effectively our own currency. It's not a cryptocurrency, but it is a currency because we no longer have to exchange dollars to exchange value. We're just updating lines on this ledger. The things on that ledger could have been euros, they could have been steak dinners, it doesn't matter. At this point, the ledger is a separate and distinct currency from whatever we use to bootstrap it to begin with. And from here on out, I'll refer to this currency as lockbucks. So the value of a lockbuck, though, is not very high, right? Because the only thing you could buy with it are things that Alice, Bob, and Carol are already buying for each other. But you can imagine that if this network were really big, if lots of people were using this ledger, if lots of people were using lockbucks, let's say, if as many people were using lockbucks as use euros or pesos, then lockbucks actually might be pretty valuable. So in some sense, the value of this currency is tied to how many people are using it. So Alice, Bob, and Carol at this point are now really transacting in lockbucks and not dollars. So we've updated the ledger to reflect that. So we could just forever keep swapping money around on this ledger if we wanted to. The problem is that this ledger is totally insecure. It's a piece of paper on a refrigerator that can be marked out or erased or whited out or whatever. So if Bob decides to go rogue and say, hey, wait a second, these idiots developed a system that's completely based on paper, I can just add my own line here that says that Carol paid me 100 lockbucks and I'll be 100 lockbucks richer. That's clearly better off than I was before. And this is undetectable because I'm allowed to do this according to the rules of our protocol. So the problem is that right now we can't actually trust this ledger at all. It's completely worthless from a trust perspective. It's a currency, but it's not a very good currency. It's not one that anyone would want to use. So we need to solve 2 problems. The first problem is one of forgery. It's possible for people to add lines to this ledger that never happened, that never represented an authorized transaction, and that are not valid. And even worse, it's possible for someone to remove lines from this ledger that are valid. So something really did happen, and you can just take a big old eraser to it or rip the ledger in half or whatever. So it's possible to alter the ledger in ways that make it completely untrustworthy. We need to fix these problems if we want this currency to be useful to anyone. First problem, how do we stop the forgery? So we need to secure this ledger, and Satoshi gave us a hint about how we do that. He said that digital signatures provide one way, one part of the security of the ledger. Here's how that's going to work. So we're going to have our transactions, and we can imagine that one way to improve the security of this ledger to prevent forgery would be to require every person to sign their name at the end of each line to prove that it was really them who recorded that transaction. So in this case, for example, Alice would sign the first line saying, yes, it was truly me who made that transaction. Bob would sign the next two lines, and so on. Well, physical signatures can be copied, and who's to say that Bob isn't just a really good forger and is able to copy Alice's signature with such fidelity that even Alice is like, oh yeah, maybe I did pay you 100 lockbucks. Sorry about that. I thought it was fake, but I must be misremembering from all the great drinks that we had last night. So what if we use digital signatures instead? This is maybe a superior alternative to physical signatures because digital signatures can't really be forged, at least not in the same way that a physical signature can. And to do this, we're going to introduce two operations that we're going to be able to perform on signatures. The first operation is called sign. We're going to sign lines on our ledger to authorize the fact that it was truly us who made that transaction. And the second operation that we're going to allow is something called verify. We're going to be able to take any line that was already signed and say, was that line, that transaction, was that really signed by the person who says it was theirs? So here's how that's going to work. We're going to ask every person to make a public key and a secret key, sometimes called a private key, but I don't want two things that start with P, so I'll call it a secret key. So public key and private key, PK and SK. The public key and the private key are inextricably linked mathematical numbers that we won't get into detail about how exactly they're linked, but basically you can combine them to get you can combine them to verify that they're basically two pieces of the whole. So they're linked that way. The public key is something that you advertise to everyone. It's like putting your name in the phone book. The secret key is something that is known only to you. It's a password, effectively. So something that you don't tell anyone else and that you never reveal. Maybe you memorize it, and then you destroy whatever physical record exists of it. Now, when we're signing our new and improved digital ledger, here's how that's going to work. So we're going to have every message, every line that we want to record on the ledger, we're going to take that as our message that we want to sign. And then we're going to use our secret key to combine that with the message, and this will give us a new, there we go, a result, basically, that is a sequence of binary digits that represents our signature. An important property of this operation is that small changes in the message, such as changing Alice to Bob or changing the amount of lockbucks we said was going to be given to a particular person, a forgery, in other words. Small changes in the message result in large and unpredictable changes to the signature, meaning it's difficult to figure out exactly how your change in the message will result in the signature. So if you know an existing message, you can't, an existing line and this corresponding signature, you don't really understand how to produce a new valid signature by modifying the message. Now, we can then take that signature, which is public, because we put it on a ledger, we say, hey, I've signed this transaction. We can take that signature and combine it with the public key that this person advertised and say, hey, was that message signed by that person? Does that signature match? And we'll get an answer if it says either yes, it was signed by that person, or no, it wasn't. And all we know about the no, it wasn't, is just that it doesn't match. We don't get any information about, well, it was actually Bob, or no, and the message that was really signed was this one. All we know is it was or was not signed correctly. Importantly, it's easy to go from left to right. It's easy to, given a message and a secret key, it's easy to get the corresponding signature. But it's virtually impossible to, given a signature, get the corresponding secret key and message. And not only is it virtually impossible, we have a specific mathematical word for it called computationally infeasible. It's not impossible, it's virtually impossible. It's not strictly impossible, but it's so hard that you won't be willing to wait long enough to find out what the answer is before you get an answer. So it might be like 100 years before you find out the right answer to this. So we want to be able to add a new rule to our protocol at this point. Now we're going to require that the lines that we add to our ledger must be signed. Any line that's not signed, not valid. And you have to sign your line in a valid way. So this time, when Bob goes to try to forge a valid message that already exists, he can't do it because he doesn't know how to replicate Alice's secret key. He can't come up with a valid signature for a message that he'd like to forge because he can't go from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. He doesn't know how to produce a signature given the message that he wants because he doesn't have the secret key. So Bob can't forge lines anymore, but can you see a problem that still exists here? Well, Bob could simply copy the line that already exists again and get paid twice. That's a perfectly valid message. All he has to do is copy it again and get another 50 lockbucks distributed to him. So Bob is back to being evil. As long as he can figure out a way to get at least one person to pay him, at some point he can drain their bank account balance on the ledger. So he can't forge lines, but he can duplicate legitimate lines. To fix this problem, all we're going to do, anybody have any guesses about what we can do here? Hand raise. Yep. Yeah, so all you have to do is add something to the messages that makes them different from one another. So you could add an identifier, you could add a timestamp, you could add lists of flavors of ice cream as long as they weren't reused. So probably integers are a little bit easier than that, so we're going to pick integers. So we're just going to have an auto-incrementing identifier that goes up over time, and we'll add that to the message. And now because we've signed the message with that, that's going to be a different signature. So Bob can't sign the message like he could before because it won't be valid. Yeah.
How can you duplicate, because each had to be timestamped, how it can be duplicated?
How can you duplicate it?
Yeah, because once you do it once, it's timestamped to the time. The second one will be different by seconds or microseconds.
Right, so that's a great question. So we're going to require that the lines have unique identifiers. So he won't be able to duplicate them because if he adds another line with the same message, it's not going to be valid anymore. So we're going to require that every line has a unique identifier. One more problem here, though. The ledger is centralized. It's a piece of paper on their refrigerator that they're adding handwritten digital signatures to. Not exactly the best system for a currency. And more importantly, it's a single point of failure. If that piece of paper burns up in a fire or falls under the fridge, the entire currency system is destroyed, right? So that's not a great way to operate the system. What might be better is if we could find some way of having Alice, Bob, and Carol all have their own copy of the ledger, but somehow still keep it all in sync. How could we do that? How could we distribute the ledger so that everybody who wants to use it can use it, but without requiring everybody to use the same copy of the ledger? Well, Satoshi said that the way you can do that is distribute copies of a ledger to everyone. Let everyone start with some initial copy, and then broadcast the updates that you'd like to all the transactions you want to make, basically, to everybody else in the network. And when you do this, let's say that Bob wants to add a transaction, right? So Alice and Carol do not know about this transaction. He's added it to his own ledger, but no one else knows about this transaction just yet. So he's going to broadcast the transaction he'd like to add to the rest of the network that's using this currency. And the transaction is otherwise valid, of course. It's got its signature and so on. He's going to broadcast that transaction, and he's going to say, hey, Alice and Carol, please add this transaction to your copies, to your ledgers. So maybe that's all we need. Maybe we just say, hey, everybody gets their own copy, and you broadcast all the transactions you want to make to everybody. Well, that doesn't quite work because what order should you use to record the transactions? When it was a single point of failure, we didn't really have any kind of distributed system. When we had that ledger on the whiteboard, anybody who got there first and recorded a transaction, that was the one that won. But in a distributed ledger world, anybody could be making transactions at any point and broadcasting them. How do we know which order of the transactions was the correct one? That might seem like a bit of an academic exercise until you realize that people could spend money they don't have, which would violate our no overspending rule, by simply broadcasting a lot of transactions simultaneously to different people. So for instance, let's say Alice has 50 lockbucks to her name in this shared ledger, and she's going to make 2 transactions now at virtually the same time. One transaction to Dave for 30 lockbucks, and one transaction to Carol for 30 lockbucks. That's a total of 60 lockbucks, but Alice only has 50 lockbucks to her name. She can't afford to cover both of these transactions without violating our no overspending rule. So if that's true, then the order in which these transactions are processed matters a huge amount, because if Dave is the one who actually gets paid, that means that Carol can't also actually get paid. So Carol will have transacted with Alice and given her something, but have gotten nothing in return. So that's bad. That's double spending. That's the problem that Satoshi was trying to solve, and that a lot of other folks were trying to solve, but were not really successful until Bitcoin came along. So we've got this problem. How do we distribute this ledger in a way that makes everybody happy and in a way that preserves the history of what's happening over the blockchain? So we need some way of trusting this ledger. We don't quite have all the trust elements yet. And Satoshi introduced one more idea, or several more ideas, but the next one he introduced was this idea of a timekeeper, of an entity that participated on the network, just like Alice, Bob, and Carol, and who might even be one of Alice, Bob, or Carol. And their job was to order the transactions, to just pick an ordering that made sense. Doesn't matter what order it was. It could be totally arbitrary. It could be, whichever transactions end in the number 4. Those are the ones that are going to go first. Doesn't really matter. The point is that there is some set of transactions. You'd like to order them, and you do it. And you put them in a group of related transactions called a block. But what makes this, you broadcast that to the networks if everybody says, hey, this is the order of transactions to use. But what makes that particular ordering better than any other ordering? Remember, it's totally arbitrary. Who's to say that just swapping, just reversing the list of transactions here isn't a better ordering? It's not, because it's it may or may not be, because it's a totally arbitrary ordering to begin with. So how do we know to trust, why should we trust that particular block over anyone else? Satoshi's idea was, well, what if we don't just transmit the transactions, but we sign the transactions as if it were another message that we were adding to the ledger? And instead of just signing it as is and then returning a signature, what if we found a special number that we could append to the messages that we were signing, called a nonce? And then what we're going to do is look for an interesting signature that results from performing this sign operation. And we're going to define an interesting signature as one that starts with a certain number of zeros. Remember, this is binary digits. So here's the signature that starts with 1 0. I found some n, some nonce, that gives me 1 0. How surprising is it that a signature in this scheme starts with 1 0? Not very surprising. 1 out of every 2 signatures look like that, right? Now, how surprising is it if I find a signature that starts with 2 zeros? Well, that's a little bit more surprising. About 1 in every 4 signatures look like that. How about a signature that starts with 4 zeros? A little bit more surprising. Only 1 out of every 16 signatures. And of course, only 1 out of, for a signature that starts with n leading zeros, the probability that you'll discover such a signature by chance is vanishingly small as the number of zeros you're looking for grows larger. So if we say that we're looking for a particularly interesting signature, let's say one that starts with 30 zeros, and if it's true that the only way to generate these signatures, remember we can't reverse engineer a message that we'd like to have from a signature. We have to keep trying messages that we want to sign in order to come up with a signature. And because we don't want to alter the content of the messages themselves, that represents the transaction, what we're actually going to alter is this number. We're just going to keep trying a bunch of nonces, a bunch of numbers that we're just going to tack on until we find one that starts, until we find a nonce that generates a signature with 30 zeros. So that's going to require a lot of work, right? Because we don't know how to generate from scratch a signature that starts with 30 zeros. We're just going to have to try a bunch of numbers to get there. So if we just have to try a bunch of numbers to get there, we're basically just, all of that work is useless, right? We're not doing anything to do that. We're just imposing a sunk cost on ourselves to find a valid signature that the network will accept. And it's, in fact, it's that investment of the sunk cost, a completely useless effort, that secures the network. The more sunk cost you have, the more costly it will be for an attacker who wants to game this system to do that gaming, because they will have to invest at least as much effort, if not more on average, to outpace the rest of the people who are legitimately using the network in most cases. So we're going to find that signature that we found before. We're going to include the nonce with it. And we're going to say, hey, here's the nonce I used to generate this signature. And here, you can see that it starts with 30 zeros. So you can be sure, because of math, that I invested a lot of effort to find, I tried a lot of nonces to find, on average, to find one that started with 30 zeros, to find a signature that started with 30 zeros. Now, why would anyone go through all of that effort? Why would they run their CPU at 100% and peg it for days on end looking for nonces? Why would they want to do that just to facilitate this network? Well, they don't. They don't want to do that. That's a stupid and terrible use of your time. What they would maybe do is, if we incentivize them to participate in a network by saying, hey, if you give us your CPU time to secure the network, we'll let you, as a creator of a block, add a special transaction to the end of the messages you're signing that says that the network, not Alice or Bob or Carol or anybody else who's a person participating, but the network itself will mint some new coins for you. We will pay you 50 lockbucks. Where did those 50 lockbucks come from? Nowhere. They were created out of thin air. That's the incentive to use the network. You have now been awarded a way to participate in the system by spending your CPU resources. So why should you pick some transactions over others? Why would you want to pick any particular ordering if they're all basically the same? Well, one reason you might want to pick a different ordering is that each person in Bitcoin and most other cryptocurrencies, each person who produces a transaction and broadcasts it can also say, hey, who's ever creating blocks, if you add my transaction to your block, I will be willing to pay you an additional sum that I'll attach to my transaction, and you'll get that fee. That goes to whoever creates this block. So if somebody successfully comes up with a signature that's valid that includes those transactions, then they will get the transaction fees for all of those transactions. So block creators get paid in two different ways. One, by the network itself, and two, by any transaction fees that are generated from people who are participating in the network. So even if you're using a cryptocurrency that doesn't have a reward associated with producing new blocks, you will probably still get paid via transaction fees. So that's how we broadcast one block. But how do I know that that block was the latest one? How do I know that some other block didn't beat me to it? How do I prevent two different people who just happen to get lucky and find two different orderings that are both legitimate orderings? Well, this doesn't preclude that, but to reduce the possibility of it happening, what we're going to do is require that every block also include the signature of the previous block that you think came before it. So that way you know which block you're working off of. In other words, you have a unbroken chain of blocks going all the way back to the very first block, or a blockchain. So this is, the word blockchain doesn't actually appear anywhere in the Bitcoin paper, but just like mining doesn't appear anywhere in the Bitcoin paper. So all of these have been terminology that's been introduced after the fact. Satoshi does make an analogy to minting coins and how this is like mining for gold. But the use of mining as applied specifically to creating blocks is never used in the paper, and blockchain as a word is never used in the paper. So those are ideas that all came after the fact. So the way we get consensus in this distributed system is we're going to trust the longest blockchain that we've seen. So if we have 2 blocks, that's worse than if we have 3 blocks. We'd rather trust the chain that has 3 blocks on it, not the one that has 2. What happens if we get 2 blocks at exactly the same time? They're both valid. And one of them is a malicious block. One of them contains transactions that are illegitimate, but someone was able to quickly guess, they got lucky. And the first nonce they tried produced a valid signature. Well, we can't tell the difference between a legitimate block and a not legitimate block. But as long as there aren't that many attackers, specifically as long as there aren't, as long as no malicious person or coalition of malicious people control more than a majority of the processing power of the network, they won't be able to guess nonces as fast as the rest of the network. And that means that the chain that is legitimate will eventually outpace the chain of attackers, and we won't trust the attacker chain anymore because it's not the longest chain. So even if you get lucky, you have to keep getting lucky over and over and over again to be the longest chain. And that's not likely to happen if you don't control a very large amount of the, or a consortium of the very large amount of the processing power on the network. So if we're going to build applications with this data structure that seems to be super exciting, what are some of the things we should think about? Satoshi didn't talk about this at all, but this is a major consequence, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 years, is people looking at how blockchains can help their software applications. And my super duper short takeaway is that you probably don't want to use a blockchain for your application. There are almost no, statistically, looking at the set of applications that is being written, almost none of them are good fits for a blockchain application. I would challenge you if you find what you believe to be a legitimate use case, or your boss says, this is a legitimate use case for blockchain, everybody stop what you're doing and blockchain the shit out of this thing. Like, that's probably almost certainly not going to be a reasonable use case. Here are some tests you can apply to decide if it is a reasonable use case. First, are you willing to wait a while for a consensus to converge about the state of the data that's on the blockchain? So with Bitcoin, one block is produced about once every 10 minutes. That's baked into the protocol. Once every 10 minutes, a new set of transactions appears. Can you imagine going to Gmail, logging in, and waiting 10 minutes for yourself to log in? Can you imagine going to your bank or swiping a credit card and waiting 10 minutes to get a slice of pizza when it's like sitting there right in front of you, but the merchant won't be able to give it to you until the transaction clears? If you're not willing to wait that long, then you certainly shouldn't use Bitcoin, and you probably shouldn't use any cryptocurrency whose consensus convergence time looks anything like that. You would want something with a latency on the order of, at most seconds for things like web applications. Second question, is it better to use a blockchain than to use a totally centralized database that is a single point of failure, that's owned by a company that isn't distributed across 5,000 people? I mean, in most cases, I would say it's probably a lot easier to maintain the infrastructure associated with one centralized database than it is to say, you know what, we're going to become experts in distributed systems overnight. Let's blockchain the shit out of this thing and distribute 5,000 copies of MySQL effectively everywhere and hope that they all converge to the correct state. Like, what are the chances of that actually happening? What are the chances of you designing a system that will work that way, that will be right on the first try? Next question, does your app actually need to be distributed? Are people coming to you? Because if so, there's no need for that to be distributed. If we're talking about a situation where there's like a larger peer-to-peer community type thing happening, that's maybe more of a stronger case here. But if you don't actually need to be distributed, then you probably don't need a blockchain. Do you need to trust the people who are using this system? In other words, you don't need to trust anybody who's on a blockchain that's governed by a cryptocurrency, because those are just transactions recorded by numbers. Like, there's no identity attached to that. But if it's important to you to know who those people are, if you need to trust them in some way, then you probably shouldn't use a blockchain, because there's nothing about the blockchain itself that in any way validates the identity of a person. Two different people can claim to be somebody. There's nothing that stops that from occurring. So you would need either some additional authentication layer or something, or a currency or a crypto system that injected more data into the blockchain that was a layer on top of that. And projects like Hyperledger, and there are some other things that are providing those kinds of layers on top of a blockchain. But again, is it worth it to do all that when we've already solved these problems for the most part in a non-distributed way? So I would argue that most applications, most of the time, for most companies, for most people, for most use cases, do not need a blockchain. Challenges around cryptocurrency. Remember earlier in the talk we said, is it a good kind of money? Think about this for a second. Would it surprise you to learn, well, let me put it this way. Would you rather have $100, or would you rather have a $100 gift card to Saks Fifth Avenue? Raise your hand if you'd rather have $100 cash. Raise your hand if you'd rather have a $100 gift card. Right, no one wants the $100 gift card because you can do more things with the $100 in cash than you could with the $100 gift card. Now, what if I told you, oh, and then, by the way, it turns out that gift cards for clothing stores retail for about 83 cents on the dollar on eBay. So if you go to eBay and you try to buy a $100 gift card for Saks Fifth Avenue, that will cost you $83 on average. Now, would it surprise you to learn that there are gift cards that you can buy on eBay right now that retail for more than 100 cents on the dollar? Is that surprising? Raise your hand if you think that's surprising. You should all be raising your hands if you said yes before, because you said you would rather have the $100 than the $100 gift card. So what would make someone be willing to pay more than $100 for $100 worth of gift card credit? Someone in the back?
The difficulty of getting that gift card in the first place?
Say that again?
Difficulty of getting the gift card and potentially greater value of the gift card over cash at the store.
Yes, that could definitely be a reason. Like, so if it's harder to acquire that than it is to acquire $100, that would be one reason. How about right here?
The potential that gift card will be worth more later on.
Okay, interesting. The gift card is actually an investment. Sure, yeah.
Maybe there are rights associated with a gift card?
There are what?
Rights associated?
Rights? Yes, that's a very good one. I think, what if there are things you can do with the gift card that you couldn't do with the $100? Any guesses, by the way, about what company or companies it might be that these gift cards that retail for more than 100 cents on the dollar are? Any guesses about that? Amazon? No, not Amazon. No. Amazon's about 94 cents on the dollar.
Money laundering or tax evasion?
Like you go to moneylaundering or taxevasion.com and buy some gift cards there. So the one I'm thinking of, and there are several others like this, but the one that is coming to mind for me is Costco. So Costco is a membership club. You can't go to Costco. You can't actually get in the door at Costco unless you're a member of Costco, or you have a gift card. So the gift card lets you do something that you can't do with the $100. Therefore, it should be worth more than $100, because there are things you can't do with $100 that you can do with the gift card. So, sorry, one second. So in a sense, the value of money is not simply what it says on the face, but what you can do with the money, what kinds of goods and services you can buy with it, what kinds of activities you can carry out. That's why the dollar that's in the frozen arms dealer bank account is not worth as much as the dollar that's in your hand, right? You had a question or a comment?
Oh, I was going to say maybe you want to conceal your transaction. So, for example, you're going to buy.
You're willing to pay more than $100.
Right.
Yeah,
let's say, for example, you wanted to buy something like lingerie for your girlfriend, but you don't want your wife to find out. So you pay more.
Yeah, I feel like if you're going to eBay to buy the gift card there because you think that's going to conceal the transaction, you've probably failed at multiple steps along the way. But I think I would argue that that's similar to the money laundering aspect. If you're willing to pay $10 for something that actually costs $5, something is amiss there, right? Like, why are you willing to pay twice the amount when the for sale price is $5? Yeah.
What about not only money laundering, but stealing from the government, like corruption? Public corruption and
sure, those people are probably not going on eBay to buy gift cards, but yes, that's certainly a use case. Yep.
Quality of currency, the hard currency versus soft currency issue. I admit this is a while before most people here were worried about it, but the Italian lira and the Israeli pound used to be notorious for wild swings in valuation.
Right.
You would pay a premium to get dollars or Deutschmarks or now euros, which are much more stable.
Right, but you probably, but in the specific case of gift cards, you probably wouldn't care that much about that. But yes, I agree. Currencies fluctuate in value because relative to each other, they maybe have different capital controls, they may have different restrictions on what you can or can't do with the currency, the popularity of the money, et cetera, et cetera. So, right, all that said, is it a good kind of money? I think the current, just my opinion, the current state of affairs is that cryptocurrencies are not currency. There's something else. There's something in between in terms of how you can use them right now. The network is not quite there, and the properties are not quite the same as money for the moment. So here's a graph of Bitcoin's price. This is actually through the end of 2017, so not incorporating any of 2018, where it exceeded $20,000 and or reached about $20,000 in value per Bitcoin. So this is the per Bitcoin price in US dollars. Each one of the horizontal lines here is 1,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. So if you walked into, if you are paying, I don't know, let's say $2,000 a month for rent, whatever, $3,000 a month for rent, whatever. You're paying $2,000 a month for rent. Your landlord comes back the next month and is like, dollars have changed. You now owe $7,000 a month for rent. You'd be pretty upset that happened, especially if your wages hadn't risen in proportion to the prices of everything else. And when you look at currencies, at least mature currencies, they don't look like this. They don't have graphs that look like that. They have graphs that are extremely boring, where the y-axis is like 0.001% high on the total value of the currency. They trade within a very stable, very small range. Bitcoin is also a deflationary currency. Specifically in Bitcoin, in the paper, this isn't really discussed, but in the software implementation that Satoshi released a few months afterwards, one of the protocol decisions he made is that there is a finite number of Bitcoin. That block reward, the reward you get for producing new blocks and contributing to the network, goes down over time, and it eventually becomes 0. So eventually, no more new Bitcoins will be created. That means that Bitcoin is, by definition, a deflationary currency, because no more Bitcoins can ever be created at some point, and people will inevitably lose Bitcoins or forget their private key. The number of Bitcoins will, by definition, shrink over time, or at least it won't be able to grow beyond the 21 million. Now, there are these memes in like the cryptocurrency subreddits that are like, deflation is awesome. What idiot would want the thing on the left where the value of what you can buy with the same piece of paper goes down over time? Why would you want an inflation scenario, say these memes? Why wouldn't you want this scenario where cryptocurrency is awesome and your one Bitcoin today buys $7,000 worth of stuff and then tomorrow buys $20,000 worth of stuff? What idiot would want the stuff on the left instead of the stuff on the right? Well, one reason you might not be super thrilled about that is that from an economics perspective, deflation discourages economic production. So let's say that you're a farmer. I'm not a farmer, so this is going to be a very simplified analogy. Let's say that you're a farmer and you plant corn. And you plant corn kernels that grow into shoots that eventually grow into corn. And you invest your time and money and sweat and blood and tears into your farm to make the corn kernels turn into corn. Right? So what happens is that you invest a little bit of money to buy these kernels, and then you put your effort into it, and then you get corn ears, which you can sell at market for a much higher price than the corn kernels by weight. Awesome. That's how you make money as a farmer in a very simplified way, right? What idiot would do that when they could just buy a bunch of cryptocurrency, sit in their house for 6 months, and then make 3 times as much money as they had before? Why would you ever want to leave the house in that case, right? So that coin production never happens, right? That economic value that would have been added to the economy, the GDP, literally doesn't happen because of the deflationary cryptocurrency. Second problem is that Bitcoin uses something called the proof of work. Remember, we have to try a lot of different numbers before you get the nonce if it's actually going to generate a valid signature. All of the work that everybody does in the network, you're not the only person trying to find the block. Everybody wants that next reward, right? So if everybody's doing all of this work, the only person, the only amount of work that was actually valuable in all of that work was the very last one, the very last number that anybody tries to produce a valid signature. Once that first valid signature is found for that next block, that's it. The rest of all of that work was completely wasted because all of that work was just done to find that one nonce that would generate a valid signature. Well, if that's true, that's basically a lottery in which one person's work is worth, unit 1, and everybody else's work is worth 0, right? Because none of them get to add a block, and only one person gets to add a block. Which leads to situations like this, where one Bitcoin, not one block, one transaction, one going to the pizza store and buying a piece of pizza uses as much energy as your house does in a week. That was in January. So, imagine what it's like today. It turns out that if you extrapolate this, if nothing changes about Bitcoin, if literally nothing changes about Bitcoin, it will exceed the world's energy consumption. The world's total energy consumption will not be enough to satisfy Bitcoin in 2021. Not like 2100, not like 3 years from now. So if nothing changes, that's what's going to happen. Now, will that happen? No, probably not, because eventually the power plant operators will notice, wow, we're using 50% more energy than we were before, and it takes a long time to online power plants. So even if they're like, wow, that's awesome, let's ramp it all up, you can't build enough power plants fast enough to meet the demand for the trajectory that Bitcoin's on. Even worse, even worse from forget about the environment, maybe you hate the environment, cool, but just from a transactional perspective, that slice of pizza, let's say that costs $5. It's not a terrible slice, it's not a great slice. $5, right? Cool. You paid $5 for that slice of pizza. If you buy that slice of pizza with Bitcoin, you will have had, in January, you will have had to pay $57 in transaction fees to make that transaction. And because nobody wants to immediately, you have to wait for your transaction to appear on the blockchain as part of a block, but nobody wants to take it on the very next block because that block might be invalidated by a longer chain in the future. It might be an attacker block, right? So you have to wait a certain number of blocks before you trust a transaction that you saw some number of blocks ago. And in the paper, Satoshi goes into this a little bit, but he doesn't really say what the right number of blocks is. But if a block comes along once every 10 minutes on average, and if you're willing to trust, if you say have about a 0.1, if you're willing to tolerate about a 1 in every 100,000 transactions is fraudulent, but you have to wait about 6 blocks before you find one, before you can be reasonably assured that none of those blocks are fraudulent. Well, if that's true, then that means that that slice of pizza that you bought, you've got to pay $57 in transaction fees and wait an hour to get your pizza. So it comes out of the oven, here's your pizza, that'll be $62, please. Oh, by the way, please wait an hour for that transaction to clear. So totally impractical for anything other than large transactions, right? So that's not how, like, will it get to a point where we can use it for everyday transactions? Cryptocurrency might. Bitcoin with a 10-minute block interval could never be used that way. So a different cryptocurrency that has different rules about what is or is not acceptable on the blockchain will probably be what we use if we're going to use anything for cryptocurrency that for these everyday sort of transactions. But that's not, I mean, maybe I sound a little pessimistic. That's not necessarily pessimistic, right? People don't use gold bars the same way they use dollars, right? But people accept, people store value in gold bars. Maybe they're crazy, but they do. But like you can use gold bars as a store of value in the same way that you can use dollars or euros or whatever as a store of value. So before I get into this last section, which will be really quick, just want to see if there are some Twitter questions. We do have a few. OK. Kamal asked, so a responsible fiat regime tracks economic productivity for inflation targeting. how to provide predictable debt on a deflating asset. Great question. A detailed answer to that is going to be difficult to give in a minute or two. I will say that in the same way that you can use options to describe a contract for some asset in the future, a derivative essentially on some real asset, you can also use similar kinds of contracts on things like Bitcoin, on things like Ethereum, on other cryptocurrency. And that's one way of doing that. Catherine Holloway asked, are newer blocks worth less than older blocks? No, I wouldn't say so. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about a block per se. It's just about the transactions. The lines on the ledger are just what are in the blocks. Catherine Holloway also asked, how much computation power is wasted in blockchain mining because consensus forms around other branches than the ones under consideration? Great question. Those are called uncle branches. When you have a branch that's off of the main one, you're not really sure which one is going to be the right one, so one of them will kind of get orphaned at some point. And in a situation like that, basically everybody's blocks, it's not usually the case that the blockchain gets more than 1 or 2 blocks ahead of the consensus view of the world. So it's pretty rare that that happens. But when it does happen, it's usually resolved pretty quickly because no one chain is going to have more computational power backing it than any other. David Golden asked, non-evil forks could happen if unlikely. What happens to transactions on a fork that falls behind? OK, right. So before we said the cryptocurrencies were made out of that cake whose recipe was trust, rules, and history. If you change any one of those things, you have a completely different cryptocurrency than you did before. You might have something that resembles what you had before, but it's totally different. So for example, if you decide to change the rules about what kinds of transactions you will accept on your blockchain, then you have forked the currency. You have created a new currency that's different from the old one because the set of things that's valid is different than it was before. And if that's true, then every time someone makes a decision like that, they're effectively creating a new cryptocurrency. So people are forking whenever that happens. So changing the rules is a big deal. Unlike maybe in fiat currency, when changing the rules is also a big deal, but do the people using the fiat currency notice that things have changed? Probably not. So again, like we said before, it's the
We have one question here too, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was curious, you were talking about the price per transaction in terms of energy cost. And one in your earlier slide, though.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, that price per transaction was not the price in energy. That was the price you would pay as a transaction fee to have your transaction be included in a block.
But I was just saying in terms of the energy statement, in which you said it was like the amount of power it takes to do a year. So, but in that earlier slide, you demonstrated that the actual ledger itself and the proof of work are two different sort of elements.
Yep.
So by that logic, if you were able to, let's say, make the ledger, like the amount of transactions, a lot bigger, and you would have the same amount of proof of work, that would mean you'd be able to drive that average down a substantial amount.
That's absolutely true, yeah. If you had more transactions per block, you would reduce the energy cost per transaction. The problem with that is now you're transmitting much larger blocks, right? So everybody who wants to participate in a network has to have, is shuffling much larger amounts of stuff around than they were before. So you've got to like add, now the size of the blockchain you're carrying locally is double or triple or whatever it was before. So there's a trade-off there.
From an ecological perspective, though, that might actually be a lot better, and from an ecological perspective, because you're able to do more with less.
I mean, strictly speaking, only from an ecological perspective, yes, that would be objectively better because you were spending less energy per transaction. But there's a saturation point at which you can't really do that anymore. You can't have 500 gigabyte blocks. Like that's just, people's hard drives aren't always going to be big enough to take the next block and it's 500 gigs every single time, right? And if we're expecting this to be a thing that people use on an everyday basis, are you going to, like, every 10 minutes, you're going to get another 500 gigabyte hard drive? Like, that doesn't really compute. So there's a limit as to how far you can go with that strategy, but it's certainly, you could scale it up that way to some extent. Yep.
Mm-hmm. We'll take this one and then we'll go on and we'll keep going.
Yeah, so towards the early question about how newer blocks might be worth less than older blocks, maybe what they're referring to is the mining reward going down for newer blocks, which...
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question. Say that again.
Oh, when you were saying earlier how somebody asked about newer blocks being worth less than older blocks, maybe they're referring to the mining reward going down for the newer blocks, which is true, right?
Sorry, what's true?
You get paid
mining reward going down for new blocks. Maybe that's what they're referring to.
Yep.
I also have another question. I was wondering for the energy use, like what if they reduce the difficulty level, like going forward? And are there any other implications of reducing difficulty?
So how does the difficulty scale for Bitcoin specifically, or just in general?
I mean, what if they just reduce that to like reduce energy use, so it'd be easier to find the right nonce?
So when you say they, what if they reduce
like
it? There is no
like,
they. This
right.
is basically the difficulty of the number of zeros you have to have in your signature of a Bitcoin is modulated by the rate at which the transactions are occurring. So as the volume of transactions expands on the network, the difficulty to do the work also expands. So that's why you can't, you could certainly change the rules. You could say, you know what, we're going to ratchet down the difficulty and make it a lot easier. But remember that what secures the network is the wasted work. It is itself, like, it's inextricable. Like what prevents forgery from occurring is the fact that you have to waste a whole bunch of energy just to put your transactions on the network, or sorry, on the blockchain. So if you make it easier to do that, you've correspondingly also made it easier to forge transactions that were not legitimate, because now you can find a signature that will match that more easily than you could before. So yes, you could certainly make it easier by getting everyone to agree that it's too hard to make transactions now and reduce the amount of work that's required, which would fork the currency. That would be something different than Bitcoin. But then you also opening yourself up to some extent to increased levels of forgery.
So doesn't it change the proportion between the good and bad actors still, right? Like good actors still have the same proportion of compute power.
That 51%.
Repeat the question?
That's the number that's required. I'm sorry, the question was, well, as long as there's still more good actors than bad actors, and everything will still be fine. And that's true in the long run, but you've still nevertheless made it easier for people to gain the appropriate amount of computing power to like get over that 51% threshold. That number is a lot lower than it was before. And in addition, 51% is 50% plus 1, not 51%, but anything over the majority. That's simply the amount required to seize long-term control of the network. There's nothing that says, there's no lower limit, there's no lower bound on how much computing power you need to make a falsified transaction. That's why people wait a certain number of blocks, so you can be sure that that's not going to wind up on some chain that's later discarded. Okay, we're almost done. Great questions. I love it. Keep them coming, but do it on Twitter so that we can finish the slides. All right, so rules. Again, at the very outset of this presentation, when you started talking about this recipe, I said that people get excited about this, but I don't think that's the most exciting part. I think the most exciting part is the rules that you use to govern how you're going to put stuff on the blockchain. That's what makes the difference between whether your blockchain is for insurance policies or for a supply chain or for currency or for people's dental records, whatever it is that you want to preserve, whatever that kind of information is, that's governed by the rules of how you structure what goes on the blockchain. The blockchain is just holding your data in a systematic way that resists forgery. That's what the blockchain's for. It's a data structure. That's it. So getting excited about the blockchain, naming conferences after, why don't we have conferences named after linked lists or whatever, because people are getting excited about the wrong thing, right? This is the thing to get excited about. How are people actually writing stuff that produces records that go on a blockchain or a linked list or whatever? That's the interesting part. So what I get excited about is, especially with cryptocurrency, is what are people using cryptocurrency for in ways that have nothing to do with the original currency or with the original intent. So Bitcoin is supposed to be a cryptocurrency. It's supposed to be for exchanging value, but you don't have to exchange value. You could just put a love letter or a message or a secret onto the blockchain, and it's there forever. You're effectively paying a small token storage fee to have it be part of this network forever. So if you wanted to, you could back up your entire hard drive to the blockchain. It would be very expensive and very slow and a very terrible idea, but you could do it, right? Because effectively, you've outsourced all of that data to everyone else on this network. So those kinds of ideas are the things that are interesting to me when I hear about cryptocurrencies and blockchain. Those are the interesting things. Bitcoin, going back to the paper itself, if you had to take away 4 things from Satoshi's paper, I would leave you with this. Bitcoin is a trustless, permissionless set of rules. It's about rules. It's not about the blockchain. It's about the rules that govern what goes on the blockchain, how you make those transactions, how you interact with other people. Because those rules are written in software, they let us trustlessly exchange value instead of with people, right? We don't need a third party or an intermediary. But again, it's also written in software. Software is always correct, right? Nobody ever makes mistakes when we write software, except for all the times when people have lost literally tens of millions of dollars because they made a typo in how their smart contract works on Ethereum, right? Like literally the elementary software bugs that any of us today would catch with a unit test have been crippling to all manner of people who own cryptocurrency. I mean, there's any number of examples I could cite. 3 weeks ago, someone lost $7 million worth of Ethereum because they published a smart contract, which is a way of asking the blockchain to run code for you effectively. So normally when we ask a computer to run code for us that we didn't ask it to run, we would call that malware. But this is the blockchain, so that's okay. So someone made a bug, basically they incorrectly specified the type of a value that was supposed to accept the amount of currency to exchange in this smart contract. And because it was a signed integer instead of an unsigned integer, someone said, I'm going to give you negative 5,000 Ethereum. And the smart contract gave that person 5,000 Ethereum. So this is supposed to be a smart contract. You could only buy stuff, not steal it. So I mean, just basic stuff like that any of us would be like, okay, let's make sure that this works. People are writing contracts for it, publishing it without a second care in the world. So there's a little bit more work to do around the resiliency of this. It's a little Wild West. But that software at the same time is what allows us to trustlessly exchange that value. The Bitcoin protocol has some serious problems, right? Proof of work does not scale, literally can't scale. At the rate that we're going, again, we'll exhaust the resources that we have for power and energy usage just to run a blockchain that you can't buy anything with. Like, what's the point of that, right? So there's some serious problems. Will they get fixed? Probably. Will cryptocurrencies evolve to replace Bitcoin or to be a successor? Unquestionably. I think we're basically at the ARPANET stage of Bitcoin, right? Like, this is the 1970s with respect to the internet. You're dragging the T1 cable behind you or whatever and shoving it into the wall to download stuff from somebody else's computer from 500 miles away, and some of the bits are getting lost along the way, that sort of stuff. So we're in that phase of Bitcoin, or sorry, of cryptocurrency with respect to this. We're not at the World Wide Web stage of Bitcoin. But I don't think it will be too long before we get there. And then finally, blockchains have enormous potential, right? We talk about all the cool stuff you could put on there. The sky's the limit about what you could do with that. But it's also still just a data structure. It's also still just a place to put shit, right? It's not insanely awesome all by itself. It's the rules that make it do that. So if we get it right, if we get those rules right, if we come up with better alternatives to some of the sort of more primitive forms that exist today, I think there's enormous potential, and I think it's worth getting excited about that. So thanks very much for your time. I appreciate you sitting for 90 minutes.
Thank you. I'm sure that people have opinions about blockchain and Bitcoin. So I will remind everyone that questions should be questions, and they should be short and answerable. That said, who has questions? Raise your hand. All right, we'll get mics to you. Don't start asking until we get mics. There we go, behind you.
So does the original Satoshi paper, or even the original implementation, specify the nuts and bolts of how these transactions and blocks are broadcast and discovered? Like, how does peer discovery work?
Yes, okay. That would probably be another 10 or so slides, but let me just see if I can summarize. Every Bitcoin client you run the network you participate in the network by running the client. So you're running a piece of software. That software uses a peer-to-peer discovery mechanism that at the time broadcasted to, you'll love this, a set of centralized servers that were hard-coded into the protocol. That list has changed over time. And basically now there's a set of tiers of places you go. So first you kind of look at the people who are close to you. You see if anybody's broadcasting Bitcoin transactions near you. If nobody is, then you go to these transactional servers that are sort of seed servers for places to discover other people who are running Bitcoin. Different people who publish clients will maybe include their own server in that list and so on. So it doesn't really matter how the discovery happens. That's not part of the how the discovery happens is not part of the protocol. So there's nothing that says these 5 servers are the trusted ones. That's just sort of agreed by convention.
Sort of DNS-like in that way? It's layered in that way. It's sort of DNS-like. There's a local.
Yeah, it's actually very similar in the sense that there's like this sort of first pass of here are the people that are close to you. You know, a few layers down, you're down to the root zone for whatever the seed network is.
John, thank you very much for the talk. Can you say a bit more about how Ledger verifies that Bob has enough money for transaction? Because Bob does sign his transactions, Alice signs transactions, but who actually verifies that Bob has enough money in his account for the transaction itself?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. So you want me to talk more about what specifically?
How Ledger verifies that Bob has enough money. So essentially,
yeah, okay, I see. So Bob, so in our example, let's just say there's 2 people. Alice puts in $100, Bob puts in $100. Bob makes a transaction for $200. Well, nowhere in there did we say Bob's current balance is whatever. Instead, the current balance is implied by looking at the entire transactional history, basically, by looking at everything up to the current point. Now, that's sort of what happens on the theory level. In the practical implementation on the software level, what actually happens is you kind of take different checkpoints along the way of this is a hash that represents the state of the world at this point. And then if you want to verify that your blockchain is intact, you can just sort of check those checkpoints and say, okay, well, I only have to rewind to this point to understand Bob's transactional history because he doesn't appear anywhere else up to that point. There's a lot more to say about like how like what actually happens when in the ins and outs of each transaction. But in general, what you're doing, just from a pure theory perspective, is you can think of it like you're starting from the very beginning and scanning all the way to the end and looking at all the transactions that involve that. In practice, that's not actually what happens, but describing the specific optimizations it's a little tough for me to do that with words. I'd have to show you some pictures.
We're going to take 2 more, I think, and we're going to go to the bar. So yeah, we'll go over here.
So you mentioned the idea of people putting things into the blockchain that were not transactions. Mm-hmm. And I know there's old work in censorship-resistant publishing, like the Tangler system that were based around Merkle trees. Are you aware of people doing that? Have people put
totally.
Like copyrighted videos or something in the blockchain for Bitcoin
videos would be
already?
a little too big to put in. You don't have that much room inside of each block to add extra data. But you can certainly publish documents, things of that sort. Unfortunately, though, this also raises some legal questions. What if you publish a document that's illegal, right? Not just censorship, but like illegal, right? So what if you publish, say, child pornography and you put it on the blockchain? It's there forever. That's child pornography on the blockchain. Like, that's probably not something you want your cryptocurrency associated with. You can't get rid of it, ever. Ever. You can't do that. So the very thing that makes it censorship resistant also makes it attractive to certain things, yes.
It's also worse than that because the standard used by most law enforcement agencies is not witting possession, but just plain possession. Mm-hmm. So by publishing digital contraband to the blockchain, you've basically turned everybody into a pedophile.
or political dissidents in these other countries. we'll do one more. I think we have one more question. Yeah.
You don't want to end on the.
Well, I don't think we're going to end on that much of a downer. We'll try one more.
I was just wondering if you're able to speak to how the circumstances in which this paper was originally released and the proof of concept was released conditioned the early development of Bitcoin Core socially. And the reason why I'm interested in that is in comparison to public blockchains that are being currently developed, which seem to be like, imagine the Linux kernel, say, at the point where it had its second developer come on, if you had say hundreds of thousands of people who didn't even know what an operating system was, didn't plan on using it, weren't investors in it, which is largely not the case now, and yet saw it as having some speculative value that placed these artificial pressures on the social aspects of developing the technology.
Sure.
It's hard to imagine projects of such size evolving in the same way. So I'm curious about if you know anything about how other people began working on the protocol after this, and when it was so much of a less popular thing.
How did it go from Satoshi to today, basically? What's the history of that? It's difficult to summarize, I think, in a few words, but basically, so there's been a lot of speculation about who Satoshi was or is, or if it's even a person, maybe it's many people operating under a single name, maybe it's Skynet, like whatever. So who knows what it actually is, right? Or who this person actually is. What kind of happened was Satoshi released the paper, 3-ish months later, released that client. It was kind of at that moment on that list, but that's when the buzz started to happen. People were like, oh, I'll just run this piece of software, generate some Bitcoin, and play around with it. Cool, I've got some Bitcoin. Awesome. This thing is neat. It has some ideas that are cool. Maybe I'll adopt that into my project, that sort of stuff. That was like the first 2 years of Bitcoin. It was like 2008 to 2010. Then people started saying, okay, how would we grow this into a real cryptocurrency? Like, there's enough people using this thing now. How do we make this something? How do you go from crazy science project to people can buy cheeseburgers with it? How do you do that? So that's when people from the payment space started getting involved. And there's always been a crypto hackers sort of cabal of people who've been following that sort of stuff. There's some precursors to Bitcoin called BitGold, for example, and eCash and these sorts of things. Those were all precursors to Bitcoin that Satoshi drew some influences from, or even cited in several cases in the paper. And it was those people who kind of drove Bitcoin in the middle years, like the next 2 to 5 years, were kind of formed a consortium around that, formed a governing body, if you will, of a group of core developers who augmented the protocol. And then from that point on, that's when it started to become more of a business, when it started to become more of a thing that people could use to buy transactions. And at that point, the dynamics of the social side of it get really complicated because Bitcoin forked a couple of times, and there's all these competing ideas about how it should work, and explaining all the various factions would probably bore everyone to death. But basically, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas about the future direction of Bitcoin, and they have forked at least once because they didn't agree about the future directions. Those are now completely separate currencies. So Bitcoin Cash, for example, was formerly on the same blockchain, same rules, forked because they disagreed about how blocks should work and the size of them, and that's kind of the rest is history at that point. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.